Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Tonight, we'll be discussing the New York City carbon emission laws and energy planning. For those of you who do not already know me, my name is DePaola, and I'm Orsid's Director of Compliance. I also run Orsid Energy, which is our energy brokerage division. Joining me tonight are representatives of our partners at Aurora Energy Advisors and Logical Buildings. Joseph Weitz is the Director of Energy Management at Aurora. Also joining us is David Klatt, Senior Vice President of Operations and Analytics at Logical Buildings. Here's our agenda and what each of us will be covering. I'll be broadly covering a few of the local laws under the New York City Greater Greener Buildings Plan and how they apply to the upcoming deadlines of the Local Law 97 Climate Mobilization Act. I'll be touching upon benchmarking generally, which will be covered in more detail later in the presentation by Joseph from Aurora. I will also be discussing Local Law 87 energy efficiency reports and retrocommissioning, and then how all of this comes into play with the upcoming Local Law 97 Climate Mobilization Act carbon emission caps. When I'm finished, I will turn it over to Joseph to cover benchmarking in much closer detail, along with recommendations to improve building scores. Joseph will also cover energy contract terminology and ESCO bidding for the buildings we manage. Finally, we will turn it over to David Klatt of Logical Buildings, who will be talking about our new partnership and innovative steps that our boards and residents can take to proactively reduce their energy costs and carbon footprints. Finally, after the presentations, we will take some time to answer questions from you, the viewers. So why don't we dive right in? So in 2009, on Earth Day actually, the mayor announced a new set of laws called the New York City Greater Greener Buildings Plan. Within this set of laws was the new Local Law 84 energy benchmarking requirement. The law requires us to input all of the annual energy usage of buildings into the EPA's Energy Portfolio Manager system. By the term energy, I'm talking about the aggregated electricity consumption for all apartments and common spaces, as well as the volume of oil, natural gas, or steam used for heating and cooling. Additional data that is put into the system includes the number of floors, the gross floor area, and the different uses of the various areas of the building, such as multifamily housing, retail, restaurant, office space, parking, educational, medical, fitness center, etc. Other building characteristics that are entered for multifamily housing include the number of apartments and bedrooms. Each year, we plug in all of this information, and the system assigns certain coefficients for each of the various fuel sources. The system spits out an Energy Star score, which supposedly represents the building's energy performance. The higher the score, from 1 to 100, the better the performance and presumably the lower the carbon footprint. This benchmarking process was initially only required for buildings 50,000 square feet or larger, but this threshold was lowered by Local Law 133 to include buildings 25,000 square feet or larger in 2018. Unless the deadline is postponed for some specific reason in an individual year, we enter the data for the prior calendar year before May 1st of the succeeding year. We have been doing this each year since 2011, and until recently, poor building performance and data errors were of no consequence. However, this has now changed with the posting of energy grades and the upcoming Climate Mobilization Act emission caps. As the law initially had no consequences for errors of building characteristic data, and the fact that some of the data required is not readily available, sometimes the scores are inaccurate and can be improved by looking closely and verifying these inaccuracies. Critics of the Local Law 84 benchmarking process frequently cite several factors that compromise the credibility of the grading system. First, the system uses square footage as opposed to cubic footage. A building might have 12-foot ceilings where others might have 8-foot ceilings. The buildings with higher ceilings and more cubic footage need more fuel to heat and cool the space. Yet this variable is not accounted for by the system. The system also doesn't take into account other building demographics, such as occupancy. An affluent building where many residents go to their vacation homes during peak energy consumption summer months and is only 50% occupied will do better than a full-time, fully occupied building where the residents don't have alternative homes. Differing apartment sizes are also not taken into account. Most apartments typically have only one kitchen and living room, and larger units may have home offices and playrooms. Occupants of smaller apartments function in a smaller space, and therefore the occupancy of these buildings are denser. A building with 10 400 square foot units would have the same overall square footage as a building with just two 2,000 square foot apartments. Yet while the system would treat these two buildings, as identical, the latter would score much better because the former has 10 kitchens with energy-consuming appliances and many more occupants consuming electricity. Also, the coefficients used to assign carbon emission value to electricity does not necessarily equate to the actual carbon generated by the grid. As new, more efficient electricity generating facilities come online and other carbon-heavy or carbon-neutral facilities, such as the Indian Point nuclear facility, come offline, the actual carbon emissions are constantly changing. Yet the system doesn't necessarily change the coefficients in real time. Further, in 2019, Governor Cuomo signed into law the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act, which requires 70% of the electricity generated in the state to be from renewable sources by 2030, and for the grid to be net zero by 2050. Currently, it is estimated that only about 28% of the New York State grid is generated from renewables. So as we get closer to the 2030 emission cap, buildings that use more electric as opposed to fossil fuels should grade better. I mentioned earlier that we are now beginning to have consequences for bad building data. The first of these is the result of Local Law 95. Under this law, buildings subject to the benchmarking requirement must now post their energy efficiency rating from the city in a conspicuous location at each building entry. While there are currently no fines for poor building performance, there is an annual fine of $1,250 for failing to post the city's rating. In addition to the numerical score, the law also adopted letter grades A, B, C, or D for Energy Star scores. The only Fs are for buildings that have failed to benchmark their energy data as required. Critics of this law cite to the fact that the letter grades are misleading. Unlike the restaurant grading system, which poor letter grades do indicate health code violations, a C or D does not necessarily indicate anything unhealthy. The new 2021 rating labels that just became available earlier this month also indicate the score for the prior year, so you can track if the building is doing better or worse. These new labels are to replace the ones posted last year. As you can see from the little yellow arrow on the sample energy efficiency rating label, the 2020 New York City average score was a 54. Despite the efforts made by this building to improve energy efficiency and to raise the score from a 57 to a 58, and despite scoring well above the average, this building still received a C. Later in the presentation, we will see that getting a good grade, a good letter grade, does not necessarily mean that a building does not need to have to take steps to avoid fines under the Climate Mobilization Act. Another part of the Greater Greener Buildings Plan announced in 2009 was Local Law 87. This established the requirement for all buildings subject to the benchmarking law to have a full ASHRAE Level 2 engineering study of the building and to file an energy audit and retro-commissioning report with the city once every 10 years, beginning in 2013. The reports are due in the calendar year, ending in the same digit as the building's tax block number. We are now nearing the end of the first decade, and by now, 80% of buildings subject to the law should have performed the audit and filed their reports with the city. Only buildings with tax block numbers ending in 1 or 2 remain to be filed this year and next year, respectively. The aspect mandates the correction or repair sorry, the reports identify system deficiencies in the same calendar year. So the retro commissioning aspect, mandates the correction or repair of the identified system deficiencies in the same calendar year within which the reports are due. However, extensions of time to make these corrective measures are available if the work is ongoing at year end. The most common retro commissioning items that we see in our portfolio of buildings are the adjustment of boiler control settings, pipe insulation repair and replacement, and the systemic replacement of failed steam traps. Generally speaking, taking these measures will typically improve the energy efficiency of the systems and have a short payback period of heating and electricity savings. Over the next couple of slides, we're going to review some excerpts of Local Law 87 reports to get a better idea of what the engineers are looking for and the useful insight that these studies really give us. The first excerpt gives us some useful definitions, and please bear with me as I read through them. An energy audit is a systematic process of identifying and developing modifications and improvements of the base building systems, including but not limited to alterations of such systems and the installation of new equipment, installation or other generally recognized energy efficiency technologies to optimize energy performance of the building and achieve energy savings, provided that such process shall not be less stringent than that of Level 2 Energy Survey and Engineering Analysis of the 2004 edition of the Procedures for Commercial Building Energy Audits, published by the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, Inc., or ASHRAE. Retrocommissioning is a systematic process for optimizing the energy efficiency of existing base building systems through the identification and correction of deficiencies in such systems, including but not limited to repairs of defects, cleaning, adjustments of valves, sensors, controls, or program settings, and/or changes in operational practices. The goal is to make the building systems perform interactively to meet the current facility requirements and provide the tools to support the continuous improvement of system performance over time. Undertaking an energy audit and retrocommissioning will give building owners a much more robust understanding of their building's performance, eventually shifting the market towards increasingly efficient, high-performing buildings. Here's a report index to give you an idea of what information you will see in a typical Local Law 87 report. General project information, a breakdown of the building's energy consumption, description of building systems, including but not limited to building envelope heating and cooling systems, domestic hot water systems, ventilation, pumps, motors, elevators, and lighting systems. Then at the end, you can see sections describing the required retrocommissioning and other identified energy conservation measures. This is a typical retrocommissioning table, which gives a high-level summary of the 6 identified measures that were required for this particular building. The table provides both an initial cost estimate for each measure and also the projected annual savings and simple payback period. In addition to what you see here, elsewhere in the report, you'll see there is much more detail, pictures of each system, parts that need work, and a written description or guide for specified corrective actions. This report identified a defective sail switch of the building's combustion fan, improper domestic hot water temperature settings, a leaking boiler, dirty boiler flame glass, inoperable steam traps, and the necessity of a boiler cleaning. You can see the most expensive measure identified and highest anticipated annual savings was the required steam trap replacement. This is probably the most common measure I see required in our pre-war buildings. It can also be one of the most onerous to get into compliance because of so many of these steam traps are in apartments buried under built-in cabinetry or radiator enclosures. We recommend to all of our superintendents and resident managers that they have a periodic inspection process to check for and replace failing traps. To avoid a very costly and disruptive retrocommissioning requirement, We also recommend the inspection of traps that are known to be operable and are part of the plan to replace all of the traps. This next slide is probably the most useful one in my entire section. This table shows the recommended energy conservation measures for a building. These are not the mandated retro-commissioning measures that the building needs to implement, but rather recommended improvements that should be made in order to reduce the building's energy bills and carbon footprint. The cost estimates range from minor to major expenditures, and each has estimated energy savings and simple payback. These are the measures that should be part of every board's CapEx budget. When discussing Climate Mobilization Act compliance, these measures should be considered to reduce a building's carbon emissions and also to lower energy bills. In addition to the table, you would expect the report to have a more detailed description and options for each of the measures. All of this brings us to the elephant in the room, Local Law 97, the Climate Mobilization Act. This law was passed in 2019 and is one of the most ambitious local efforts in the country to reduce carbon emissions. The goal is to reduce New York City carbon emissions by 40% in 2030 and 80% of current levels by 2050. These are hugely ambitious goals. Rather than giving credits or rewards for reductions in building emissions, the law will impose very steep fines for exceeding carbon emission limits in 2024 through 2030, when a much lower carbon emission cap is implemented. This is vastly different than the programs we have seen to date, which offered carrots in the form of financial incentives, either through Con Ed or NYSERDA or other programs, to reward energy efficiency measures. As you will see in the next couple of slides, based upon current carbon emission calculations, it is anticipated that roughly 80% of buildings would see a fine in 2031 for exceeding the 2030 emission cap if measures are not taken to reduce energy consumption before then. Initially, the law had carve-outs for all buildings with rent-regulated apartments. However, this was changed last October, and now the threshold was increased to 35% or more regulated units in a building to qualify for the emission cap exemptions. The fines for exceeding the thresholds in any given year are $268 a ton of carbon emissions, and this would be the most expensive carbon pricing in the country. This next slide is just an inverted parabolic chart indicating the number of buildings in New York City on the left and the carbon emissions per square foot on the right. On the bottom. This is the same chart indicating the impact of the 2024 emissions cap based upon current building emissions. You can see in red the amount of buildings which face financial fines in 2025 for exceeding the 2024 carbon emission threshold. As you would expect, this seemingly indicates that only those buildings with the highest emissions per foot would face fines. And finally, we see the impact of the 2030 emission cap. As you can see in red, the vast majority of buildings will face financial fines in 2031 for exceeding the 2030 carbon emission threshold. It is estimated that currently approximately 75 to 80% of buildings are exceeding the 2030 emission cap and thus would face an annual fine of $268 per ton of excess carbon emissions. Most of us, or at least I don't, think in terms of tons of carbon emissions. So this is a pretty random number to think about and what it means for any particular building. What we of Orsid have been doing over each of the last couple of years is to try and put this into perspective for each of our boards. Over the next few slides, you'll see estimated fines for most of our buildings based upon the 2020 energy benchmarking that we did earlier this year. We have about 4 pages of this schedule, and we have hidden the property addresses to protect the innocent. However, we have documents for each of our boards, which indicate the specific letter grade and the projected penalties under the CMA. You can see that I highlighted many of the rows with the higher letter grades, either an A or B, that we will be posting this month, but which still face significant annual penalties for exceeding the carbon emission caps. So the very heavy CMA fines will hit even some of the best performing and well above average rated buildings. Some of these high-performing buildings even have 2025 penalties for exceeding the 2024 cap. And many of the A-rated buildings face six-figure annual penalties for exceeding the 2030 cap. 34 of the 147 buildings on this list, or about 23%, have either an A or a B posted, but yet face significant penalties for exceeding carbon emission caps if they do nothing to improve their scores and or reduce carbon emissions. So what are the ways to comply with the CMA and to avoid fines? Generally speaking, 1, take conservation measures to reduce energy use. 2, switch to cleaner burning fuel sources. This could be done by a major capital project to convert an oil burning building, an oil burning boiler to a natural gas, or converting a building's natural gas chiller to electric, or some other project like this. 3, install solar and or electricity storage capabilities. This has very limited applicability for most buildings in New York City because current technologies cannot generate significant amounts of clean solar energy without a huge roof. In most instances, the payback period is too long to justify these projects based upon current technology. 4, purchase up to 10% of carbon offset credits. However, this is currently only available to comply with the 2024 emission limitation unless it is changed by legislation. 5, purchase 100% renewable energy credits for carbon emissions over the cap. However, these energy credits must be what is known as Tier 4, or locally generated here in New York City. So unlike purchasing your electricity from a green ESCO, where it's generated from a hydroelectric dam upstate or a wind farm in the Atlantic, these are few and far between due to the challenges of generating any significant solar or wind electricity in the city. There was proposed legislation that would have expanded the utility for CMA purposes energy credits generated upstate, but this was rejected by the legislature in Albany. Hopefully, this will come up again before 2030. And 6, there is a potential under the law for carbon trading, and the hope is that a market will develop for buildings significantly below their caps to trade their carbon emissions to buildings over the cap for some amount less than the $268 a ton penalty. However, there is currently no such market that I am aware of. This slide is just to reiterate something that was touched on before, because when the CMA initially came out, many buildings planned their compliance around the fact that they had a handful of rent-regulated apartments. However, this threshold was increased to 35%. So unless more than 35% of apartments in a particular building are rent-regulated, and I know of very few cooperatives and condominiums that exceed this percentage, the building must get below the caps to avoid fines. Even these buildings have to make certain building upgrades or other energy reduction measures to avoid CMA fines. This next slide is a sample Climate Mobilization Act letter grade notification and emission penalty calculation flyer that we have for all buildings in our management portfolio. These were created by the NPower Group, and we have done this for each of the last 3 years to get this information out to all of our boards, well before the emission caps come into play. The specific document for your building is available from your account executive, and NPower is just one of the firms available to plan energy efficiency projects for CMA compliance. So wrapping all of this up, what should we be doing now to plan for the CMA? First, get an understanding of your building's carbon emission footprint and benchmarking data. For this, one of the best tools we have is the building's local 87 report. 80% of buildings should already have done a report and filed it with the city, and the remaining 20% of buildings will need to do their audit over the next 15 months. Look at the recommended measures with very low ROI now. Also consider implementing now other low-hanging fruit, such as converting all common area lighting to LEDs, changing oil fuel grade from number 4 to number 2 oil, maintaining installation of all heating piping, and verifying that all heat traps are functioning properly. Consider other major capital improvements as indicated in the reports to upgrade old building equipment, such as boilers, chillers, windows, etc., to move to new, more energy efficient equipment. This should be done, of course, in conjunction with appropriate architects or engineers that can help plan for comprehensive energy efficiency measures. Trying to get these measures into the building's CapEx plan and budget now is very important. Finally, leverage our energy partners to review benchmarking data and to encourage more efficient building operations. And with this, I will now turn over the webinar to our energy partners at Aurora and Logical Buildings. Joseph? Joseph, I think you're still muted. Sorry, can't hear you.
Still can't hear you. Just bear with.
Better?
Yes.
Okay, much better. All right, thank you, Dennis. My name is Joseph Weitz, and I am the Director of Energy Management at Aurora Energy Advisors. Some quick background on who Aurora is and our work with the Orsid portfolio of buildings. Aurora is a full-service energy management company working with over 100 owners and managers across the country and Canada. We've been a partner firm with Orsid for nearly a decade now. In partnering with Orsid, we have become your outsourced energy manager responsible for everything that touches the energy line item of your annual budget. This includes anything from annual energy purchasing that we'll discuss shortly, energy budgeting and reporting, reviews of energy efficiency proposals, and a continuation of the last topic, local law compliance. So Dennis did a great job discussing the benchmarking process in pretty good detail, and I'm going to very quickly touch on some of the nuances of the law and how it's being approached with Orsid. Local Law 84 includes all buildings 25,000 square feet or larger within New York City. And as of a few years ago, that now counts roughly 20,000 buildings that have to comply with the benchmarking law on an annual basis. And the way that we look at the law, it's really broken into two parts. The first part is space parameters, understanding how the building composition or envelope of the building fits into the portfolio manager system relative to other buildings under the law, and the energy usage for your building. And that feeds well into the next. The deadline typically May 1st of each year. But I believe for years, there was an extension to the law due to some data problems from Con Edison National Grid. So we talk about data. The utility company is responsible for porting that information into the system, into the portfolio manager system where benchmarking is conducted. When there are problems with that data, it delays the process. It calls into question the accuracy of a lot of the submissions. So that has pushed this back a number of months over the last few years. I know Con Edison National Grid are actively working on fixing this process, but it is definitely a work in process and something that everyone is keeping a close eye on as we get towards some of the more meaningful laws that could potentially cost a substantial amount of money when we're talking about carbon fines. And the second part of the law are the space parameters. And there we're talking about every square foot within the property and how it translates into the formula for benchmarking Local Law 95, the letter grading law. Over the last year, and really starting around this time last year, the Orsid team has worked very closely with us to validate and make sure that the parameters are accurate inside of the portfolio manager system. I think we found that by upgrading certain components, let's say when the law was first introduced, there was some uncertainty as to what level of square feet you should be counting as part of the process. Over time, it was found that we should be including all below-grade space that has energy usage attached to it. So by adding in below-grade space, there was a meaningful impact to the square feet. Or by counting units that were previously noted as studios with no bedrooms as one-bedroom units, we would see meaningful increases to the benchmarking process and Local Law 95. And that takes us to the next slide, where there are really two main takeaways here. The first is that the process of validating data is year-round, that the benchmarking typically, the window starts around February of each year and concludes in May. We like to say that there's no wrong time to review your information. So if you go to look at your Local Law 95 grade that was updated this month, and you see that there's a meaningful variance or something that you don't understand or would like to dive into greater detail, now is just as good of a time to review the information, make sure that it's accurate, and that will give you a better insight as to what you could expect for Local Law 95 and Local Law 97. And we put in here that those grades should be taken with a grain of salt. Dennis sent over a building today that saw a reduction in their score year over year. And the energy usage was roughly flat, and there wasn't really a sense as to what happened. We took a greater look at the information and saw that the portfolio manager system, it assumed that nationally it was warmer and there was less consumption that should have flowed into the buildings year over year. That did not count the fact that most people were working from home. There was a greater need for heat and a greater need for electricity to be used over the winter and the summer. So while most buildings will see some level of decline in their grade, the system isn't counting for pandemic-related usage. So while we always say that the grades are a strange way to look at overall efficiency, this year very much so should be looked at as an anomaly year. And if we're making energy decisions, let's look at 2019, and then let's look again at 2021 when there are updated scores that come out. So that covers really our sense of the local law compliance process. Now we want to talk about energy purchasing, specifically as it relates to gas and electricity. And that's probably a very much a hot topic right now, with articles being written every day about changes in the energy markets. But very quickly, the price per therm or price per kilowatt hour is split between two different components. We have delivery and supply. Delivery is the price you pay to either National Grid or Con Edison, the utility company, for the right to use their transmission lines to bring the service to the building. There, we don't have any ability to control that cost. We're merely a price taker under the approved tariff. Historically, that rate would be about 50% of your overall cost without fail. Over time, the Public Service Commission has approved various rate increases that is now pushing the delivery component to a higher number than supply. On the supply side, that is the ability to control a component of your price by purchasing your commodity from a different source. You may know them as energy supply companies or ESCOs. There are roughly 200 of them operating within the New York City confines. We typically work with roughly 10 for Orsid, and on the other spectrum, there are 10 that we say should likely be in jail. And thankfully, with different regulations coming in with different reset orders, those 10 will likely be out of business before that ever happens. Move on to the next slide. So we have three options when it comes to energy supply. We can purchase from the utility. That's our default service. But similar to the way that delivery works, we are simply a price taker from month to month. And while the utility price will track with the overall market, there's no guarantee that it will move pretty consistently. So there could be a month when the overall market declines, but your utility rate moves up substantially. And they're regulated. There isn't much they can do. That's going to be your price. We typically recommend moving away from the utility in other than some very rare situations. The other two options that are available are fixed price agreements, and then there's a hybrid strategy known as the adder or basis methodology. Fixed price is relatively straightforward. We take a forward view of the market on the day the contract price is considered. We lock it in. It's best for budget certainty. It takes away a lot of the risk for forward fluctuations in the market, but will typically come with some type of premium associated with locking in today. And then that's even more prevalent today when we look at the next few months, and the market is trading at a high point from November through March, and then we get to April and beyond, and there's a meaningful decline in forward rates. So it's a very interesting conversation to have on the fixed side. And more often than not, we would recommend the hybrid strategy, where we're only locking in a very small component of the overall rate, whether it's on the electricity for the capacity side or on the natural gas side with essentially pipeline charges. There, we lock in everything less the commodity component and allow that to fluctuate on a monthly basis. Here, we know we're essentially paying market minus, so we're able to negotiate a rate that is below what you would otherwise pay, and then we are paying at market because the commodity is trading on a monthly and settling on a monthly basis. We always have the ability to pivot to some type of fixed strategy if we go with the hybrid basis model. If you start with the fixed, you're locked in for the duration of the term. If we go with the hybrid model, there's always some flexibility, and we look at that as the most nimble of the contract options between really these three that we have on the screen. And when we say not all ESCO contracts are created equal, when we issue an RFP for pricing, we're only going to a very small group of suppliers that have conformed to the Orsid Energy contract template and model. It's important that the supplier has a solid financial backing, that they've been vetted for customer service and price competitiveness, but it's equally important to understand that contract terms are important. You may sign an agreement that you think will lock you in at a certain rate for a period of time, only to realize that there's a component that was excluded. And over the term of the contract, you're paying contract plus a certain value. So it's important when we review energy contracts, and we can assure that every contract that you're reviewing as under Orsid Energy has all of these components locked in. So when you look at your final invoice, it's the rate you expected to pay and nothing more. Green pricing, it feeds into the energy conversation in that there was always an opportunity to purchase green energy under deregulation. You can add that green premium to your electric price. Originally, it was a relatively small number. Now we're talking about maybe half a penny per kilowatt hour. And then you can make the claim that you are purchasing 100% green power for the energy in the agreement. That green energy is coming usually from somewhere out west, from a wind farm or a solar farm, and it won't offer much beyond a certificate and the ability to make the claim that you have offset your green power. As we move forward in time with Local Law 97 and green pricing to be able to offset some of your energy usage, that will have to come from within New York State. It will be substantially more expensive, and there's only a finite amount that's going to be available. So we always have the option to purchase the green power that will offset some of your carbon use nationally, but it's more in name only. It doesn't offer much of a premium beyond that. And then this final slide speaks to the Clean Energy Standard that was introduced a number of years ago. That was designed to both incentivize nuclear production, so basically pay out the nuclear provider to ensure that they stay financially relevant compared to some of their lower cost options, whether it's with natural gas or dual fuel sites. And then here we have the renewable energy component, that you have a certain amount of power coming from green sources. So even if you're not purchasing green power on your own, the REC is going to continue to increase, meaning that more of your energy is coming from a cleaner fuel source. As that happens, energy charges and the associated rate will increase as a result of the Clean Energy Standard. But it's generally positive in that even if you don't do anything on your own, you know that your power is becoming more clean and your energy production is going to be less carbon intensive.
And with that, we will turn the presentation over to David. Thank you so much, Joseph.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dennis, and everyone for your time this evening. I really appreciate it. I'm David Klatt, and this is Christine Carroll from Logical Buildings, and we're super excited to be partnering with Orsid on energy efficiency and smart building technology initiatives. And I would say that everyone here really has a great opportunity to be a true leader in climate change in New York City now. And just as a fun side point, I actually live in an Orsid building, and I know our resident manager is really excited about our smart building tech. So starting at a high level, Logical Buildings is the leading provider of energy management and smart building technology for multifamily in New York City. And our goal is really to make energy efficiency easy, fun, and rewarding for the building and the resident manager. And so we'll get into some of the details of the products here on this slide in a second. But at a high level, our bread and butter is creating real-time cyber-secure energy data. This includes electricity, gas, water, and steam, and also building systems data, including things like indoor air quality, domestic hot water supply temps. And then we train resident managers to use that data on a really simple, easy-to-use platform to achieve these goals. And the goals are, one, reduced energy usage and carbon emissions for the building. We generate outsized cost savings, and we actually generate revenue for the buildings, which we'll talk about. And then also responding to building systems faults. So things like, is the domestic hot water temp too high or too low? Is the boiler plant down before someone takes a cold shower? So for example, we might put a temperature sensor on a domestic hot water line that will literally text the resident manager that the temperature has dropped below a certain threshold. So the building is literally talking to you and talking to the super and resident manager and telling them what's wrong. So resident managers and residents both love our products because we make the building more comfortable, but also create energy savings at an extremely high ROI. So let's get into a couple of the details here. So a multifamily building's energy grade and carbon emissions is calculated using the entire block and lot of the building. And that includes both the building's core building systems, which we'll talk about, and also the energy usage in apartments. And on average, about 50% of the energy that a multifamily building uses actually flows through the core building equipment. So that might be the elevators, the pumps, the motors, amenity spaces, the boiler plant, hallway cooling, exhaust fans. And then about half of the energy usage is actually in the apartments. So that would come from appliances, your air conditioning, your lights, etc. And we're the only company with technology that caters to both the building operators, your supers and resident managers, as well as the residents. And so we believe that every single building should start with the lowest hanging fruit from an energy efficiency standpoint, which is starting to take an actual data-driven approach to simply running the building more efficiently. And our platform SmartKit AI is designed to do exactly this. So at a super low cost, we create real-time energy and building systems data for resident managers and train them to run the buildings more efficiently. So our message is very, very simple. At a high ROI, we're going to generate these three values for buildings. So starting here on the left, carbon reduction. And again, it's a simple platform that rewards resident managers for being energy efficient. The training is really key. We really focus a lot on helping resident managers understand the building's energy usage and the key checklists and protocols to make the building as efficient as possible. Earning money. We are what's called a demand response aggregator in New York, which means that Con Edison, they pay logical buildings to pay you at the building to use less energy at peak demand times. And it's actually really only a few hours a year, but there's a lot of value embedded in being able to reduce your energy usage for those few hours a year. And we will literally send a check to the building for thousands of dollars. And finally, we're enhancing building health by monitoring things like water leak detection, indoor air quality, domestic hot water supply temps, monitoring things like smart thermostats and amenity spaces. The business model for us on SmartKit AI is a one-time installation, and then there's a low fixed monthly subscription fee, and the system pays for itself in usually less than 1 year. Moving over to the right is Grid Rewards. This is actually brand new technology, newly capable in New York. And it might ring a bell for some that Con Edison has recently installed new, more advanced energy meters at the buildings for all of the residents as well. And all of these new meters actually enable new energy efficiency opportunities for the residents as well. So Grid Rewards is an app for residents. It's self-sign-up. There's no installation, where residents literally connect their Con Edison account to the app, and it helps them track their real-time electricity usage, their carbon footprint. We provide energy efficiency recommendations for the residents. And then one of the core features of the app is the name of the app, Grid Rewards. We will text, email, and send a push notification to residents when Grid Rewards events occur. So it might be, today from 3 to 5 p.m. is a Grid Rewards event. And if you can reduce your energy usage during that event by doing things like unplugging appliances or raising your cooling set point by a couple degrees, we will send you a check. We will pay you to use less energy at specific times. Next slide, please. We are a partner with both Con Edison and NYSERDA. NYSERDA stands for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, and they're in charge for doling out all of the energy efficiency incentives in New York. And so we are a smart meter share my data partner, demand response aggregator. On the NYSERDA side, we're an approved real-time energy management system and service partner. What this means in combination is that we're able to provide our technology platform at a 20% rebate from NYSERDA. So we deliver that at the lowest possible cost, and we deliver a maximum energy savings value by being a Con Edison partner and demand response aggregator. And here, just to recap, we deliver real, very measurable value through improving energy usage behavior, by training the supers and resident managers with data-driven guidance, digital controls, and checklists. And on average, our buildings achieve about 15% energy revenue as a percent of their electric bill, as well as a 10% reduction in utility usage, carbon emissions, and cost. So the results are significant and real, and it's really hitting that low-hanging fruit of starting to run the building with a data-driven approach for the first time, a real-time data-driven approach. Great. So what is the call to action here? We are here to help develop a data-driven path to Local Law 97, Climate Mobilization Act compliance at an extremely high ROI. And we believe in this two-step process. Number one is really hitting on all of the low-hanging fruit. And we believe that step one for every single building is to utilize energy management software and on-site training to reduce energy usage, carbon emissions, and create outsized utility cost reductions. So this is really about taking your existing systems and making them as efficient as possible before you might have to invest in any major systems upgrades. And then step number two is, once all of this great data has been collected and created for the building, that data helps prescribe deeper energy conservation measures. So if you want to consider things like clean heat, which is a fuel source change, or community solar, electric vehicle charging, battery storage, LED lighting upgrades, the data that gets generated from using SmartKit AI helps prescribe what the best, most efficient capital projects might be for a particular building. And over here on the right, this is just a snapshot from one building of what a high-level scope of work will look like that we'll be providing to all of the buildings. So it'll describe the scope of work, the light touch metering and sensor equipment that we propose to put in the building up here on the right. The system comes online extremely fast. So the energy data is instantaneous. We integrate into your new Con Edison electric and gas meters. And then within a couple of weeks, we're installing sensors like water leak detection, indoor air quality, domestic hot water supply and return temps, installing any smart thermostats, and you're off to the races. In general, our carbon reduction goal in implementing the system is about a 5 to 10% reduction. And so everyone's proposal is going to include a ROI analysis, which is down here on the bottom, which will include our system cost and training. Everything that we insert into a building receives this NYSERDA real-time energy management rebate of 20%. So the net investment is pretty small. It's all in data gathering and control equipment. It's about $10,000. A typical building might see $10,000 to $25,000 of annual savings. We have an annual training and monitoring cost, of which, again, NYSERDA pays for 20% of. Then there's a net cash flow and a payback projection for the building. And so we are preparing all of these proposals based on buildings' historical energy usage data, as well as Local Law 87 reports in our database of thousands of buildings that have implemented similar technology. So again, it's a really exciting new opportunity to truly be a climate leader, but do it in a very high ROA, low cost way.
Thank you, David. And now we're going to get to the Q&A portion of our webinar. Nita, do we have any questions?
Yes. We have one question that came in, Dennis, and it is, To be clear, do the letter grades measure both building energy use and the energy use meter to individual apartments? How does the city and do buildings access the information from the individual apartments?
So the short answer is yes, it includes everything, and I will turn it over to Joseph, who is integral in our benchmarking process, to describe how it is aggregated.
So many years ago, the city introduced a whole building aggregate data request that cost $102.50 per building. I think they realized that in order to get more accurate reporting, they had to waive this fee. So now it works that Con Edison will upload whole building information into the portfolio manager system by meter and rate class. So all of the individual unit apartments will be uploaded under an EL1 rate class. So we have access to it under the portfolio manager system. And if you are interested as to what rate class and meter is using what, that can be provided to you under the reporting.
This is one of the reasons why when David came to us with the technology, that we saw we had to create this partnership. We had to get them in our buildings because we can't get under the climate mobilization emissions caps by just dealing with the building systems. We have to change the behavior within apartments and residents. And the Smart Grids AI app, which I'm going to be giving to my kids as part of their allowance, so any money that the household earns, they can get in their allowance and just have to turn off the AC for a few hours. I think it's just really intuitive and a great product. And David?
I would just add that any individual's energy usage data solely belongs to them. And even the state has stated many times that Con Edison, while they're warehousing the data as well, they're doing exactly that. They're warehousing it, but they don't own it. Your individual energy usage data only belongs to you.
Great. Thank you, David. We have another question that has come up. Have we looked at time of day rates for electricity versus fixed rate? Some apartment owners have moved to it. Can you help us evaluate this?
David?
Short answer, yes. We could evaluate that for any single individual apartment and also for all of the building's common area meters as well.
And Joseph, do you see significant opportunities there for buildings to save?
I would say it depends on the rate or the usage profile of the building. I think that's where David and his team come into play, where they can look at the individual 5-minute data from Con Edison and let you know before any rate conversions go into effect, whether or not there is a rate savings to be realized.
Great.
We have another question. During the winter months, our building is extremely warm. In fact, all board members admit to opening their windows to be comfortable. Where do we go to get help to resolve this?
I would just say we'd be happy to come take a look at your boiler controls.
Yeah, additionally, it could also indicate that the traps in the apartments are failing. So the system is not optimized. As part of the local 87 building audit, we'll take a look at that. And certainly taking that information and combining it with the technology that Logical Buildings is bringing will certainly create opportunities for efficiency. So again, people are not opening their windows and letting the heat go out while the boiler churns and churns and churns, just because one apartment on the top eastern portion of the building requires that steam and everybody else gets overheated.
Okay, and David, to your point of coming in to visit, how can they go about scheduling this?
So what we're doing is David indicated they're creating proposals. We have proposals for every building, and we're going to be working with the account executives to get this before the boards for them to consider. The account executives will be able to handle basic questioning, but if there's any additional discussion that's wanted, if people want to talk about it, about their specific building, both David or I would be able to jump in with any board to answer any of those questions and to try to get a comfort level with the systems and really dive in and bring this technology to as many buildings as possible.
Okay, great. At the moment, there is no further questions. Dennis, I toss it back to you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I hope this was informative, and I hope that it's constructive and that we can take meaningful steps in the future as we get towards the 2024 emission cap and 2030. There's going to be a lot of work to do for a lot of buildings, and I know boards have very tight budgets, especially on the capital side. So hopefully with the implementation of the logical buildings technology, we could take meaningful strides in that way. But we'll also be looking with the Local 87 reports to see what else we need to do to develop your capital budgets to get under these thresholds. So again, thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.